Hi, I'm John Spencer. I'm the world's leading expert in urban warfare and the author of the book Connected Soldiers and another book called Understanding Urban Warfare. Today, we're going to talk to you about business leadership lessons from urban warfare, and it's not about being the old school general. We're going to talk to you about why winning and losing on the battlefield and in business is about meaning. We're also going to talk about why leaders like President Zelensky tap into the emotional source code of their nations, not once, but consistently.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. November the 9th, 1989, and the Cold War began to thaw with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we all sort of breathed this sigh of relief. And then, on February 24th, 2022, Russia once again invaded the Ukraine, expecting things to go the way they did in February and March of 2014, when Russia invaded and subsequently annexed the Crimea Peninsula from the Ukraine. But it didn't go the way they thought. Well, according to our guest, a good part of why that didn't happen, why it wasn't as easy, and the answer to that is urban warfare. What is that? And what can it teach us about modern day leadership is what we're going to discover in the next couple of episodes. So stay tuned. I promise you it's going to be a riveting couple of shows. But for now, for the moment, as always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please do us a favor. It's really important. Go rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It really helps us to stay up on people's radar. And if you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 listeners. And we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. By the way, I know you're curious. My name is Dov Baron. I am your host, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. In February, as I said, February 22nd, of 2022, Russia once again invaded the Ukraine. Clearly, they thought it was going to be another walk in the park, and it wasn't. As we record this, we're about to enter the fourth quarter of that war, and with it, the anxiety of nuclear war has returned to the world. Many are wondering about the implications of this and what might happen about that war over there, how it might impact us over here, and whether we should actually just butt out and mind our own business, because America has been kind of the peacekeeping world. Well, that's iffy, but, you know, it's been the police force in many ways, and many are believing that we should mind our own business. Well, we're here to talk to somebody who might actually have an insight on this that's certainly enlightening. So our guest for the next two episodes is John Spencer. He is considered by many one of the world's leading experts on urban warfare, but he's also a radical thought leader, experienced war veteran, team builder, and creative mind. John is an award-winning scholar, professor, author, combat veteran, and is internationally recognized for his expertise and advice in urban warfare for other military-related topics. John currently serves as the chair of the Urban Warfare Studies at Madison Policy Forum. He's recently served as the chair of the Urban Warfare Studies and Modern War Institute. That's at West Point. He's co-director for Urban Warfare Projects and host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast. He's the author of 2 books this year, Connected Soldiers, Life, Leadership, and Social Connection in Modern War, and Understanding Urban Warfare, a book that was written for the Ukraine civilians it just went viral and has helped hundreds and thousands of civilians and helped them to defeat the world's second biggest military. So that was, of course, Russia. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome the urban warfare man himself, Mr. John Spencer! And the crowd goes wild, young man.
Thanks, Dov. It's an honor to be with you, man.
I'm really looking forward to this, John. I know you and I talked quite some time ago, and it took a while to get us here. And I remember that when we originally spoke, we were like, well, we don't know where the war will be at that time. And here we are. It's changed a lot. But before I get into all of that and what that always means, I want to start here. As a military man, you're also a professor and advisor. You're all this. I'm always fascinated by all of my guests to ask this question. What is the origin story of what gives your life meaning? Because it may not have anything to do with where you are presently, but it may indeed do that.
So that's a great question, Dov, and I relate so much to your material about meaning, the emotional source code, and identity. So I think my search for meaning started really after I graduated high school, joined the U.S. Army at the age of 17. I was searching for something, and now after I'm a little older, I can reflect back and know that I didn't know what I was going to be, what I wanted to be. I knew I wanted meaning deeply. I wanted a new sense of identity because up to that point, I had, no clear definition of who I was, what I stood for, how my values interacted with my community. And the military gave me that. So I served 25 years in the U.S. Army, 2 combat deployments, traveled the world. I was a part of some very high-level strategic research groups, which taught me how to think, how to ask questions, how to challenge our assumptions. And I was an advisor to the top 4-star general in the U.S. Army. Just really, I've been blessed with an amazing life that led me to where I am today. And as you have, my life before the Ukraine war was different. I had become the world's leading expert in urban warfare, which is a small community. I get to travel the world. I go to war zones from India to Israel to Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, studying how people win battles, how people fight. But then when the Ukraine war happened, it was really a moment, and Dov, I know you have many other guests who've had these moments, a moment where I had to decide, again, who are you and what matters to you? So I made a decision to take extreme risk in my life and in my profession to write a book for Ukrainians on how to defeat the second most powerful military in the world.
So I remember when we were talking about that when we first met, and I thought, there's this weird line between the U.S. and America. It's a diplomatic line, right? Between the U.S. and USSR or Russia. There's this diplomatic line. It's like, we don't really like you, either side. We don't really like you, but we're not going to say bad shit about you because you could get a bit edgy and do things. And that obviously has changed a lot with the Ukraine. But here's the thing that I want to ask you. I've got my own opinions. As you know, I have a couple of those. But why do you think the world has responded differently to this invasion, which was around the same time of the year, which is obviously strategic about when Russia decides to invade, February, March, this time versus when they went and got the Crimea and they annexed that? I mean, they've annexed other places too. They've done it before. People have kind of sat back. This time they didn't. Why do you believe it was different this time?
So, Doug, there's no simple answers to history or even current events. Actually, I think living is learning, and I study a lot. My strong opinion on why this time was different is that the Ukrainian people fought back. I think the free world, 50 plus nations decided to join in Ukraine's struggle to be free because they voted with their feet and with their lives that they are not a Soviet, they're not Russian, they're a free, democratic, with a government that they elected country.
Mm-hmm.
There's immense history in Ukraine. Ukraine predates Russia.
Yes.
Kyiv predates Russia. But you can, and since I study war, you can point to times in where governments fall, invasions happened, and if the people don't fight, then they lose already. Whether that's the president of their country staying in country, but I honestly believe, and one of the reasons they're not a part of NATO, so the actual security agreements that would have involved all of NATO couldn't be enacted. But once the Ukrainian people showed the world that they were willing to fight for their freedom, that's what people identify with, right? And when I visited Ukraine, it felt more like my own country's struggle to be free than it did anything else. Where people, some big bully comes in and says, no, you're going to live the way I tell you, and I'm going to subjugate you. But then there's a whole population of people, bankers, grandfathers, kids that fought back and said, no, that's not the life that I choose. So there is good and evil in this world. And I think that's the last bit. The conduct of the Russian military drove the support to Ukraine.
But did the people not fight back in 2014?
So, the eastern part of Ukraine is different, right? So I do urban warfare, right? So massive cities of millions of people.
Yeah.
There is that part of the aspect. Did they resist? Yes. But there was Russia was very good at what they call Russian new generation warfare, where they insert political instability. And that is, it happens around the world. You've been to Iran, it's the history of warfare in itself. And Russia was able to instill enough political instability in those regions that it caused the instability where some people didn't fight. Some people actually, okay, no, I'm pro Russian. And that's all good and dandy. I mean, that's what people do. They vote with who they're going to be. And there's a process for that. Mm-hmm. So Ukraine today is not the Ukraine it was in 2014.
That's my point here. So that's
absolutely.
what I want people to understand is that, so you would know probably more about this than me, but just forgive my ignorance here. So Russia previously had, when the changeover went and you got the Ukraine, Russia installed Russian families in the Ukraine, in the Donbass area, in that whole region, who were very pro-Russian. So they're now part of the Ukraine, but they're pro-Russian. So there's that tension there that's immediately put there on purpose, obviously with a long-term plan. And I think that Russia's always had a long-term plan to regain the Soviet Union in some way, shape, or form, whether it was Georgia, the Crimea, or wherever it was. That was always part of it. And that instability has always been there. It was there before with the Crimea. But that's my point. They weren't able to do it. Like the Ukrainians weren't able to fight back in the same way as they've done this time. And so I'm really fascinated with what is the difference. Is it that they Russia went after Kyiv or went after the major cities? They didn't really do that the first time. Is that what the difference is?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of differences. Absolutely. I agree with you that inserting Russian-friendly political leaders is step one.
Yeah.
And once the Orange Revolution happened in Ukraine, that predates the seizure of Crimea, but that was the people saying the current president was as pro-Russian as you can be, and he actually led to Russia.
Yep.
but the it wasn't a coup and it wasn't a it was literally the single leader who was voting. They wanted to be a part of the EU.
Yes.
Like the Ukrainian majority saying they want to be a part of Europe and not Russia, Asia.
Right.
In the Crimea, like you said, they insert Russian-friendly political leaders, insert Russian antagonists. That doesn't allow for that mass mobilization to happen.
Right. So one of the things that you and I had talked about this in our previous conversation. We also have to look at it, for me, in the work that I do around negotiations and helping people to understand and getting people to understand the emotional source code of another, and rather than seeing them as your enemy. And because you read the Putin report that I did on the emotional source code of Putin. If we shift into his shoes for a moment, I'm not saying that he's a good guy to do that with, but just to shift into his shoes for a moment, here's a man who's a leader of a country with NATO on every corner, who sees NATO as the puppets of the United States, which I can't disagree with too much, feels incredibly pressured by this constant threat of NATO on his borders. Ukraine saying we're going to be part of that. And I'm not saying he didn't have another agenda, but the thing becomes, I can understand that anxiety of feeling like the enemy is at the door on multiple fronts. Again, that doesn't justify the behavior at all in my mind. And there's more about that we can get into in a moment. But it does bring up this whole thing around when people are saying, well, we shouldn't be involved. A lot of people on the right in the US are saying, we shouldn't be putting that money in there. We should be putting the money into our own borders and blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. Whatever you're saying. But what if we take a step back at a geopolitical level or even foreign policy level and say, well, we're actually a big part of what caused this bloody war with the behaviors that we've done by creating this anxiety. What's your thoughts on that? You're a strategist. You're a war strategist. You may have a very different opinion than mine. I understand that. That's okay.
No, I actually, you're the Putin expert. I did teach strategy at West Point, so I have a good idea of the geopolitical aspects. And if that was true, although that Putin wrote in his own hands his ideals of reconstituting the Soviet power,
yes,
the fact that Ukraine is not, there is no Ukraine, and the Ukrainian people are Russians and they don't deserve it. There shouldn't be a Ukrainian language, very genocidal public statements.
Russia World.
Yeah.
That was the book, right?
Yeah. I think the argument about NATO, maybe it was a contributing factor. And if so, as people that educate leaders, what kind of a bad risk decision was that to make a risk decision that the solution to that problem was to invade the second largest country in Europe, and it wouldn't be viewed by the entire world as an upset to the entire global international rules-based order, which it was. Mm-hmm. And he increased NATO's membership, his borders with NATO. So if that was, I personally don't, I believe it was a narrative. It may be a concern. Absolutely. Leaders want power. They want to keep power.
Yep.
They don't like threats to their power. Like you said, you're threatening my identity. That's exactly the worst kind of threat you can do to somebody.
Yep.
I think it was not about NATO. It was about Ukraine deciding it wanted to be free. And that conflicts with his ideals of power as well, in what used to be the Soviet Union. I mean, Volodymyr and Putin, Zelensky and Putin create their identity from this same, their names come from the same Viking.
Yes.
But they each have their own definite, I think the NATO argument is actually null and void at this point.
Okay.
Were we a contributing factor of that as the leaders of the free world, the leaders of the NATO alliance? Maybe. Like you said, it doesn't justify what's happened since.
No.
It is geopolitical, and all these things matter. I personally think that the Orange Revolution, kicking out the Russia-backed president, having their own elections, electing their own leader, wanting to be a part of the European Union, because that's why the revolution started, was more of a threat to Putin's ideology than NATO encroaching on his borders. And if that, like I said, if that was a thing, he'll go down in history as the worst military strategist of the modern era, because now he's increased his borders. He's unified people.
Yes.
The entire NATO alliance, which arguably before Russia's invasion of Ukraine was, had major issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even Donald Trump talked about that, right? And it was very clear there was a ton of issues. But going back to this other side of it, which is that we should stop being the world's police force and we should butt out, particularly with the context of the fear of nuclear response, because now this is a very, very real thing. I mean, I said that in the intro, right? I'm old enough that I remember those TV shows and the commercials. We were trained what to do, as kids. And now we've got open shooter training. I remember nuclear war training when I was a kid at school. So, that fear is very real, particularly for those of us who are old enough to remember those kinds of things. And so that argument, which is, we should be trying to find a peaceful way to come together. Talk to us about that, because I can understand that argument, but I don't know how you can get to a peaceful outcome with somebody who is saying, no, I own this.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a legitimate concern of a lot of people. And a lot of people fear what they can't control.
Yeah.
And feel like everything is getting out of control. But, since the invention of nuclear weapons, there have been a global standard of what those weapons are supposed to be used for. Nobody has threatened Russian territory. So the idea that Russia would need to use nuclear weapons in order to defend itself goes down the line of his genocidal thoughts that Ukraine is not a sovereign nation.
Right.
By definition of the world, Ukraine is a sovereign nation. And that's why things like the United Nations vote unanimously that what Russia is doing on trying to just say that parts of Ukraine are theirs is against the UN Charter. But we are in uncharted territory with nuclear weapons. Absolutely.
Right.
But actually, I think, one, to say that the U.S. was, shouldn't have been involved. We weren't involved. We didn't stop Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
No.
Again, the Ukrainians stopped the Russians from erasing Ukraine from memory. We support through weapons, along with 50 other nations, helping them defend themselves, because I think this was the United States moment. And again, whether you're an individual or you're a nation, in history, you will be questioned on who you are as a nation. And I think that's what happened. So on the nuclear card, if we would have just said, hey, Russia has nuclear weapons, we can't get involved, that would rewrite the rules-based international order that exists to hold everything together. That's the global economy, our businesses, all of it is interconnected. Because he had nuclear weapons and Ukraine didn't. Literally, that's the definition of why we created the United Nations. A lot of the laws of war after World War II, the never agains. If we would have allowed him to move into and do that because he had nuclear weapons and not support Ukraine, there's not a single U.S. soldier involved in combat in Ukraine.
No.
But if he would have been allowed to, Dov, that would lead to World War III. That would lead to nuclear war, in my opinion.
So your opinion is, if we hadn't have been backing the Ukraine, and by I say we, I'm talking about the NATO, right? Not just the U.S., that it would have escalated much more.
Absolutely. He would not have stopped the Ukraine, because he just created a new rule, which means any country on my borders who's not a member of NATO, doesn't have a nuclear weapon, it's mine. And I'll reestablish the Soviet Union. I'll take Moldova. I'll threaten anybody who's not, starting with anybody who's not NATO, because they can't touch it because I have nuclear weapons.
Right.
If you would have allowed that reasoning, it is literally the rise of Hitler with a nuclear weapon, saying, look away while I commit genocide.
Yes.
Raping babies to death, massacring, deporting babies into Russia and giving them to different parents. Just look away because I have a nuclear weapon. Look, that's why I got involved, because of what I was seeing. And I think that's why we have global support. Like, look at who, if this was, leading to a world war or a nuclear war, other people would have joined Russia in saying, look, what the world's helping, that's not right. Like China. The fact that Russia doesn't have China as a friend right now should tell the world that this is about maintaining the global international order. And Putin, you know him as an individual better than I do. I know war better.
Yes, of course.
Is trying to rewrite the all the standards which allow us to thrive as a human race.
So this is very interesting because there is such a much bigger picture and such a much smaller picture. I think that people tend to be microscopic or macroscopic, and I don't think you can be either. I think you have to be both, right? And so, yeah, there's the geopolitical play out. There is, as you said, the rewriting of the rules of war if we allow him to continue. And at the same time, who is this human being and how was he formed, created? What's his identity? What's his emotional source code? What's driving him? And then there is the bully factor. Yes. That becomes a political machine. So you were on the ground, right, in the Ukraine this summer. When you're on the ground, I know you were meeting with a lot of military leaders and strategists and all this kind of. But did you get out and meet the people?
Absolutely. That's what I want to
tell us a little bit about that, because that to me is like. I've seen some footage and stuff, and it's like war is incomprehensible. We talk about empathy and compassion, but you're hiding your kids under a basement or something. I mean, that's mind-boggling, right? Talk to us about what you learned about the people.
Yeah, I learned that it wasn't military that defeated the second largest military in the world, especially the second most powerful military in the world. It was civilians. Yeah. So especially I went to study the Battle of Kyiv because in wars, your capital cities, had Russia been able to penetrate the Ukrainian capital city of Kyiv, raised the Russian flag, the war would have been over. Had they forced the president to flee, like war is politics. Yes. This is about the political body that is governing the nation in the sovereign borders. I spent more time with civilians than I did military because it was the civilians. This wasn't a story of Red Dawn. It was a story of Red Defense. Yes. As soon as on February 24th, they got the word, like all these civilians in Bucha or Pin, all these villages that surround and make up the city of Kyiv, got word that the Russians were invading. They got their personal weapons or the government handed out weapons and went out and fought. And I know that a lot of people around the world say that that's what they're going to do. Even us Americans, right? We're going to, actually, that's
easier to say.
It's easier to say. I haven't actually seen it a lot of places. So when the Russians start trying to get into the city, it was these civilians, these grandfathers, some with military experience from a long time ago, or 16-year-old kids banding together and blocking all the streets and then start ambushing Russian. But what I felt when I talked to them was that identity. It was, some of it was about Ukraine, but Ukraine, like I said, was evolving. It was becoming something. But inside each one of those individuals, like, no, I want to be free. I want my children to be free. Yeah. I want us to say what we are going to be. And that's the people I met, which I've never met in my entire study. I've been around the world. So many people at that street level united and had that courage to fight, right? So that's cultural as well. But to say, not only no, but I'm willing to fight for my freedom at that level, like I do, it took leadership as well. It took leadership from the president and from everybody putting out messages, which then inspire people. Because leadership is about, you got to tell them what to do, which is where I came in with my book. You can't just say, go out and fight, because that's just going to get people killed. Leadership is about telling people what to do, but also motivating them, inspiring them to do it. And that's what was happening day to day as they were fighting literally for their freedom.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, obviously we don't know the quote final outcome of this because it's not the end, whatever the end means. But what I'm certain of is Ukraine will be rewritten in history from what it was at an identity level. Because, we talked about this with the emotional source code, that we have identities as individuals, we have identities as tribes, as nations, etc. And the identity of the Ukrainian people will be very different than it was a year ago, already today. But by the end, right? It's kind of like when I meet people, it's very interesting to me that when I meet people who are Iranian, who are here, they always refer to themselves as Persian, right? Because they want nothing to do with that government, and there's an identity with that government, and I think it'll be something about that. Even if Russia wins, right? And I don't see that happening, but even if it does, the Ukrainian people will not be the same. They will be different. They will be seen differently. They will feel differently. We are already at the end of part one of our interview, and I'm loving our conversation. Thank you so much. And I want to just make sure that you get a chance to tell everybody where they can find out about your books and about you and all the things you've got. Can you do that? And then we're going to come back for part two, and we're going to dive deeper into this because it's fabulous.
Sure. So I'm John Spencer. You can find me at johnspenceronline.com. You can find all my books, everything I've ever written. I'm big on social media, especially Twitter at Spencer Guard. Yeah, you can find, and of course we will make sure that we post all of those notes on there. Now listen, we're going to be back in one click. If you have to delay, you do not want to miss the second part, because we're going to talk about, well, where are we now in this situation? Because it was looking like Russia was defeated, and now they're starting to drop some pretty heavy missiles on some major posts. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about what John has been teaching at an urban level to these people. And also, what does this mean for us in the context of leadership? Because, you've heard me talk about this many times on the show. Leadership used to be that you're the general, you're in charge, you decide, you tell people what to do. But in many ways, it's not unlike urban warfare today, because you have got to be able to disperse that pressure, allow people to take the lead. And John is really the expert in how to understand that. So I want to take you into the leadership side of it as well. We're going to be back with all that in part two of the show. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. Check us out. We'll see you in one click.